the worry is that when you get to the bit that you're not so good on, that's when they're going to smuggle in Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
My suspicion is that you have a reservation about some of what Jordan is saying on substructures, on stories, and much more, because you're worried that at some point, either on this stage or off it, at some point when you're not looking,
yes, or when I am looking,
he's going to Jesus smuggle you.
Yeah, that's a. Well,
is that fair?
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe I'd just carry him in on a cross.
Yeah, right. Well, that is an all too apt analogy, because it is what worries me, and it's more subtle than that, because it's not to think that you're consciously doing it is a different claim. There's. I don't think there's anything insincere about your argument for the importance of religion, but it's also possible. We've all met the people who we believe are making insincere arguments and are really they're consciously putting the rabbit in the hat and then pretending to be surprised when it pops out, right? Mm-hmm. And the analogy to magic is actually interesting here, because we over dinner were talking about the difference between real and fake art, and we were talking about this paradox that the art seems to be incredibly valuable, and yet the value isn't located in the object itself, or can't be obviously located there, because a forgery that is materially the exact copy of some masterpiece is essentially worthless, and the real masterpiece, even if it suffered some damage, would be incredibly valuable. And so where is the value to be located? But what worries me about your enterprise, Jordan, and the way in which you seem to be linking our rational project and our scientific project with religion is right here. There's a difference between, and magic is a decent analogy, there's a difference between, paradoxically, real magic is fake magic, and fake magic is real magic. The only real magic in the world produced by magicians is the fake magic, where the magician, like someone like Darren Brown, will tell you, actually, no, I can't read minds, and I did put the rabbit in the hat, and this is fake, but the surprise is that even knowing it's fake, you can't understand how this effect is being achieved. Whereas the fake magicians are the ones who are pretending to be real, who are hiding, who are not acknowledging the mechanics, the real mechanics behind what is in fact effective, the illusion that the rabbit pops out of the hat. And what I worry with some of the way in which you discuss the power of story, the power of metaphor, and the religious anchoring there, is that the leverage and the utility can be had even while acknowledging the real mechanics of it, the fakeness of the magic, right? And you seem to suspect that it can't, that takes all of the wind out of the sails.
I'm not so sure what of it's fake and what of it isn't. Well, so I would say that I do consciously participate in the process that you described. But you see, I would also make the case, and this is certainly one of the things that we've been discussing, that you do it unconsciously. And let me make the case for that for a minute, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'd like to see your response. So when I really read The Moral Landscape a lot, and I thought about it a lot, and so this is what it looks like to me. So you make the proposition that we have to breach the gap between facts and values, because otherwise our values are left hanging unmoored, and that certainly brings about the danger of nihilism, but also a potential danger of swing to totalitarianism, something we agree about. I truly do believe that. Right. And then you perform an operation, a conceptual operation, and you say, surely we can all agree that, and then you outline a story about this woman who lives in this horrible country, who's basically just being starved and disease-ridden and tortured her whole life and having just a hell of a time of it, to put it in a phrase. And then you say, well, surely we can all agree that that's not good. And then you contrast that with, at least in principle, the sort of life that we would all like to have if we could choose the life that we have. And then you say, well, we could start with the proposition that we should move away from this terrible, hellish circumstance, and we should move towards this more ideal perspective. And you say, if we could only agree on that, then. And so,
right.
like, so far so good. But there's a couple of things that go along with that that are quite interesting. And so the first is that actually what you're claiming is that the highest moral good isn't existing in that better space. The highest moral good is acting in the manner that moves us from the hellish domain to the desirable domain. It seems to me to be implicit in your argument. So there's a pattern of behavior that constitutes the ethic.
Well, I would say that existing in that better space is good enough as well. So, I mean, there's the question of what it takes to move from where you are to someplace better, and then there's just the someplace that's better.
There's both of those. Well, but perhaps we could say, look, what's the ultimate hell? It might be existing in the hell that you described, but it also might be, this is something worse, I think. I think that participating in the process that brings about that hell is actually a hell that's even deeper than the hell. So it's an analogous argument. There's the state of being in a good state, but there's also the state of being that brings you to that good state, and then there's the state of being that's that's a terrible state, and the process that brings you to that terrible state. And one of the things that I've learned from the archetypal and religious texts that I've studied, as well as the philosophical texts, is that the process that transforms society into something approximating hell is a lower hell. Now, the reason...
Well, let me just close the loop on that, because I'm pretty sure I disagree. One, you can imagine two counterexamples. One is you can imagine a sadistic being, you might even call him God, who would create a circumstance of hell and populate it with innocent souls, right? Now that's, presumably, that action, it need not be attended by a lot of suffering. Or you could imagine some...
No, but it's still wrong.
Oh, totally
it's still
wrong. Yes.
No,
yes.
you could even imagine someone who enjoys generating hell.
Yes, it could be a source of
but that would even be more
joy.
wrong than not enjoying it.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so we want to separate out two things. We want to separate out these states of being and the process that brings them into being. And I do believe you do that in your work, because basically what you suggest is that the appropriate way to act ethically is to act in a manner that moves us away from hell and moves us towards a desirable state. Now, the thing is that as far as I'm concerned, there's a couple of things about that. The first thing is that I wouldn't say that that mode of acting is a fact. I would say it's a personality. And that what you're suggesting is that people embody the personality that moves society away from hell towards heaven, for lack of a better term. And the reason I make that argument is because I think that you recapitulate the essential Christian message precisely by doing that, because symbolically speaking, at least as far as I can understand, stripped of its of its metaphysical context, let's say, that the purpose of positing the vision of the ideal human being, which, independent of the metaphysical context, it's certainly what the symbol of Christ represents, is the mode of being that moves us most effectively from something approximating hell to something approximating heaven. And then part of that message is, and this is also something that's dead along the lines of what you're arguing, is that the best way to embody that is actually to live in truth. I mean, so because I would say that the fundamental Christian ethic, metaphysics accepted once again, is to act in love, which is to assume that being is acceptable and can be perfected, and to pursue that with truth, and that you should embody that. And then I would say that the purpose of the representation, we could call them metafictions or archetypal representations, is to show that in embodied format so that it can be imitated, rather than to transform it into something that's diluted in some sense to an abstract rationality. Because I don't think the abstract rationality in itself has enough flesh on it, so to speak, which is partly why in the Christian ethic there's an emphasis that the word, which is something roughly akin to rationality, has to be made flesh. It has to be enacted.
But is the flesh made of dogmatism and superstition and otherworldliness? Is that part of what gives it its shape and necessity? I think traditionally, historically, it has been, and that's been the problem with religion. If you denude it of everything that is unjustifiable in the light of 21st century science and rationality, I think what you have to get down to is something quite a bit more universal and less provincial than any specific religion, much less Christianity per se.
Well, it's interesting too, though, that one of the points that you do make is that you do appeal to or assume the existence of a transcendental internal ethic, something like that, which I would say, by the way, just since we're going down this direction, seems to me to be something very akin to the idea of the Holy Spirit, which is something like the internal representation of a transcendent universal ethic. Now remember, I'm trying to strip these concepts of their metaphysical substrate. I'm not making a case at the moment for the existence of the great man in the sky. We can get to that later. I'm saying that what seems to be the case is that we have underneath our cognitive architecture and our social architecture a layer of symbolic and dramatic and narrative representation that instantiates the same concepts, but in a multi-dimensional context. One of the things we talked about in Vancouver, for example, is that the religious enterprise doesn't only emphasize rationality. It brings music into the play, and it brings art into the play, and it brings drama, and it brings literature, and it brings architecture, and it brings the organizing of cities around a central space. Like it's pushing itself, it's manifesting itself across multiple dimensions of human existence simultaneously. And to me, that gives it a richness that cannot be diluted without loss, and also a motive power that a pure appeal to rationality, I don't think can manage. And this is, see, one of the things, this is maybe a good place for Douglas to leap in. See, one of the things that Douglas, who's claimed upon multiple occasions to be an atheist, and I don't know how he's feeling about that at the present time.
Yes, well,
but it doesn't matter. One of the things Douglas has pointed out was that there are things that we've done in free countries, let's say, broadly speaking, in the West, that are worth protecting. And that in order to protect them in the longest sense, it's conceivable that we need a cognitive structure, something like that, that can act as a bulwark against those forces that would seek to undermine and destroy it. And Douglas has been driven, I would say, to some degree, to hypothesize that for Christianity, for all its faults, or we could say Judeo-Christianity, to broaden it, for all its faults, might provide something approximating that bulwark if we could only figure out how to utilize it properly. So,
yes. I mean, one of my problems on this is that it seems that we are where we are with belief, whether we wish it to be or not. We cannot believe as our predecessors believed, even if we wanted to. We know too much more now, and it puts us in this very difficult position. But to denude ourselves of the entire story seems to me to be a fool's errand, for a set of reasons. One of which is that from a lot of travel, a lot of speaking to people from all around the world, it doesn't seem at all obvious to me that what we have in countries like this one is the default position of human beings. In fact, it strikes me as being very rare. Order, even political order, political liberalism, political freedom, very, very unusual things. And if you like the things that helped to get you there, with all of the caveats we could throw in all evening. And it's not the only thing that got us there, obviously. But that if you like, broadly speaking, where we are, you've got to be very suspicious at the very least of saying, the whole story's no good, we don't need the story, we can move on. I quote quite often the radical theologian Don Cupid, who was often described as an atheist priest. And Cupid says somewhere in a recent book, he said, we can't help it. He said, for instance, the dreams we dream are still Christian dreams, whether we like that fact or not. And without being able to believe myself, certainly not being able to be a literal believer, I worry. Yeah, I worry about what happens when the square is denuded completely. And that's why this discussion tonight, and you two in particular, are right on the cusp of this, because this is where I think a lot of us are. Even if we really wanted to believe, we basically can't. And by the way, very quickly, that's why I think there's an additional, just to refine my previous point to you, Sam, that's why there's this additional thing. I think there is a fear, which you may have, which I also have, which is if there's a risk that even what I've just said, never mind what Jordan has also said, there's a risk I think some people feel that you're going to soften up the land somehow. And that even if neither Jordan nor I are going to suddenly start Jesus smuggling, we might create the conditions that make it easier for someone else to do that.
Yeah.
Is that a fair?
Yeah, and it is. Yeah.
No photos.
This is very Christian of you. Yes. So.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can sharpen up what my concern actually is here, because it's not even true to say that I think you need to get rid of the Jesus story, or even not. I don't even think there's something problematic with orienting your life around the Jesus story. I think that can be reclaimed. But so, for instance, I was walking yesterday in this fine city of yours and saw someone on the sidewalk giving tarot readings to people. He had a tarot deck spread out. He had a few cards spread out, and he was soliciting people. And I'm sorry to say I didn't sit for a reading, but tarot cards, if you're familiar with them, are the quintessential artifact of New Age woo, right? I mean, these are not thought of as legitimate tools of divination, except by people who think that they're legitimate tools of divination. And yet, a tarot reading can be truly powerful, right? I mean, this is built on something, right? This is not just a massive example of self-deception on the part of people reading and people getting their cards read. These cards can seem prescient. I could give you all a reading right now, and 95% of you would find what the cards would say to be relevant to your lives. I mean, I could do it with an imaginary deck. I mean, an invisible imaginary deck. I don't know anything about tarot cards, but I'm going to turn over two cards now. One is the sun, and the other is the fallen man. Now, I know so little about tarot that I'm not even sure the fallen man is a tarot card. Right? Or I think it was the hanged man as a tarot card, right?
Man, yeah.
Okay, so I've got these two cards. And, the sun is clearly the representation of wisdom, right? And the hanged man is the representation of lost opportunity. And I can tell you with some degree of certainty that all of you are at a crossroads in your life, right? Where you have good reason to believe that you're not making the most of your opportunities, right? Now, I could go on like this for an hour, right? And pretend all the while that it has something to do with the cards actually working in concert with the dynamics of the cosmos, such that these cards that I turn over, were they real, would be the ones that of necessity were revealing something about your mind in this moment. And obviously people think in these terms about astrology and sympathetic magic and all the rest, and religion is built upon this kind of superstition. There's a way of understanding the utility of using a device like this and the real effect it has on you. I mean, if I turn over the cards and ask you to look at your life in this moment as though for the first time through this lens, considering in this case lost opportunities, right? Of course it's going to be valid. That doesn't make it can be an incredibly useful thing to do. My main concern is that at no point do you have to lie to yourself about your state of knowledge about the mechanism, right? You don't have to believe tarot cards really work.
There's deeper mechanisms at work with someone who's actually good at that. And so I agree with what you've said.
But they need not be supernatural.
No, I don't think they are supernatural. In fact, I think what happens when you use a projective technique like that, because that's essentially what it is, if I'm good at interpersonal attunement and I'm quite intuitive, what I'm going to do, and everyone does this in the course of a dialogue that's actually working well. I'm going to flip over the cards, and I'm going to start with generic archetypal statements that are true in some sense for everyone. But then I'm going to watch you both consciously and implicitly, unconsciously, with all of my social intelligence, and I'm going to see through very, very subtle signs on your part when you respond positively to what I'm saying and when you respond negatively. And I'm going to continue down the lines that you establish by your positive responses.
Yeah, but that's what Darren Brown does. He's a mentalist.
Right, well, it's exactly what happens when children are interviewed, for example, by people who lead them as witnesses, right? The children infer from the emotional expressions of the person who's interrogating them what it is that they actually want to hear. And
well,
so they'll
even work with that horse, clever Hans.
Exactly, right. That's right, exactly. Yes. Even horses can do this. So tarot card readers can definitely do this. Yes. So the mechanisms behind something like that, even if it appears entirely superstitious on the surface, are often deeper than is revealed at first approximation. So, and I wanted to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, for a minute about rationality, because we've already agreed, I think, and definitely stop me if I'm wrong, that there has to be an intermediary mechanism between the world of facts and the world of values. And well, since we've talked, I've been reading a variety of commentaries on Immanuel Kant. Mostly these have been written by Roger Scruton, by the way. And this is actually the issue that Kant obsessed about for most of his philosophical life. And what he concluded was that empiricism can't be right and rationality can't be right as philosophical disciplines because you need an intermediary structure, and that we have an inbuilt intermediary structure. And that structure is what mediates between the thing in itself, the world of facts, let's say, and the outputs, the values. So then I was thinking,
the truth is we don't quite agree on this. I mean, in my summary of your view of me, I would have agreed with that. But for me, it's just facts all the way down.
Okay,
you're describing more facts.
Glad to hear it, man. Yeah. Why do you need a brain then?
Well, a brain is yet another part of reality. I mean, what I mean by a fact
what does it do?
Anything that is the case.
If the facts are just there, what does the brain do? It has to do something, because otherwise you don't need it.
Oh, well, sure, it does a lot,
okay.
But your concern, to jump to where I think we're going in this conversation, is how is it that values can be another order of fact? That seems problematic to you. It seems problematic to David Hume.
Well, it's problematic for me for a technical reason, which is that in order to act, and we see if we agree on this, in order to perceive and to act, which I believe are both acts of value. To perceive is an act of value because you have to look at something instead of a bunch of other things. So you elevate the thing that you're perceiving to the position of highest value by perceiving it, by deciding to perceive it. So it's an act of value.
That gets translated in my brain into just more facts. You're just giving me the facts of human perception.
Well, okay, that's fine. That's no problem. Right. I'm perfectly happy about that. Yeah. And then in order to act, you have to select the target of action from among an infinite number, near infinite number, close enough of possible mechanisms of action. And so what a biological organism does is take the facts and translate them into perception and action. And the only organisms that do that with one-to-one mapping are organisms that are composed of sensory motor cells, like sponges, marine sponges, which are composed of sensory motor cells. They don't have an intermediary nervous system. So what they do is they sit in the water and they make a sponge. They're so simple that if you grind a sponge through a sieve in salt water, it'll reorganize itself into the sponge. So that's quite cool. The sponge sits in the water.
Don't do that at home.
And what it does, is there's waves on it, and so those are patterns. And then the sponge opens and closes pores on its surface in response to those patterns. So it maps the pattern of the waves right onto its behavior with no intermediary of a nervous system. But it can only map waves, that's all it can do, and it can only open and close pores. That's it. So it does one-to-one fact-to-value mapping. Now what happens is that as the complexity of a biological organism increases, two things happen. The first thing that happens is that the sensory and motor cells differentiate. So now the organism has sensory cells and motor cells. So senses to detect and cells to detect and cells to act. Okay, so then it can detect more patterns because it's more sophisticated at the sensory perspective, and it can do more things because it has specialized motor systems. But then what happens is that as it gets even more complex, then it puts an intermediary structure of nervous tissue in there, and that structure increases in the number of layers of neurons. And what that means is that as that happens, and as the sensory cells become more specialized, and as the motor output cells become more specialized, many more patterns can be detected. Those are roughly equivalent to facts. And many more motor outputs can be manifested. But a tremendous number of calculations has to occur in that intermediary nervous tissue. And that's the structure that I'm talking about. That structure exists, and it translates the patterns into motor output. And it doesn't do it on a one-to-one basis because there are more patterns, more facts, than there are motor outputs. So what has to happen is this tremendous plethora of facts that surrounds us has to be filtered to the point where you pick a single action, because you can't act otherwise. And so the mechanism that reduces the number of facts to the selected action is the mechanism that mediates between facts and values. And it's not simply in and of itself, it's a fact that exists, but it isn't a simple, that what it does isn't a simple fact. You can't explain it. You can't understand it.
Why not? Why not?
Why
is that a fact?
For the same reason that you can't.
I mean,
Look, for the same reason that you don't know what a neural network is doing. Like you can train a neural network, an AI neural network.
There's a distinction between facts and facts that we know, right? There is whatever it is the case, right? And then there's our understanding of it and our misunderstanding of it. So there are many things that we think we know that we're wrong about. There are many things that we are aware we're ignorant of, and there's always this larger space of reality that we're struggling to engage with. And it may in fact be the case that in evolutionary terms, I mean, we know it's the case that we have not evolved to understand reality at large perfectly. That's not the sort of monkeys we are, right? And you could even argue that one cognitive scientist who some of you may have heard of, Donald Hoffman, is arguing now, very colorfully, that human consciousness or the human mind is actually evolved to get things wrong in fairly specific ways, so as to maximize survival, and that
was the argument I made in our first discussion.
No, but here, no, it was not quite, because this still preserves the difference between getting things right and getting things wrong. His argument is that getting things truly right, having a nervous system and a cognitive architecture that could really understand reality, quote, reality as it is, would be maladaptive. And he has some mathematical demonstration of this, that the quote true representations of reality are categorically maladaptive, and that there's a certain kind of error that is, and I'm not sure I buy this argument, but the fact that you can make this argument, the fact that you can differentiate the adaptively useful misunderstandings versus a true understanding that's maladaptive, the fact that we can even talk about that demonstrates to me that we have this larger picture of what is in fact true, whether we know it or not. And this is what religion gets so catastrophically wrong. I mean, religion gives you some other mechanism whereby to orient yourself. In this case, revelation.
Religion does provide those functional simplifications. That's
but
its purpose.
They're simplifications appropriate to the Iron Age.
Well, some of them are.
If then.
Some of them are, for sure, and that's why we have to have this discussion, because mere revelation and mere tradition is insufficient, and I truly believe that we can agree on that. But back to the biological argument. So, because I thought that tonight I would make a very strictly biological argument, is that. So now the question is, now you've got your sensory systems that are detecting the world of facts, and you have your motor output system, which is a very narrow channel because you can only do one thing at a time. And that's one of the things about consciousness that's quite strange. It's a very, very narrow channel. So you have to take this unbelievably complex world and you have to channel it into this very narrow channel. And you don't do that by being wrong about the world, but you do that by ignoring a lot of the world and by using representations that are no more complicated than they have to be in order to attain the task at hand. It's like you're using low-resolution representations of the world. They're not inaccurate because a low-resolution representation of the world isn't inaccurate any more than a low-resolution photo is. But they're no higher resolution than they need to be in order for you to undertake the task at hand. And if you undertake the task at hand and that goes successfully, then what you've done, and this is basically the essence of American pragmatism, what you've done is validated the validity of your simplifications. So if the tool you have in hand is good, if the axe you have in hand is sharp enough to chop down the tree, then it's a good enough axe. And that's part of the way that we define truth pragmatically in the absence of infinite knowledge about everything. Okay, so now you build up this nervous system between the world of facts and the world of values, and it narrows the world of facts. And the question then is, how do you generate the mechanism that does that narrowing? And this is what's useful.
But I mean, that's not quite how the cake is layered. Because the facts are up here too, right? For me to even notice that you're a person, right, or to attribute beliefs to you, or to have a sense of being in relationship at all, this is one of those higher order interpretive acts based on a many-layered nervous system.
Yes,
right?
It's not only bottom up.
Yeah, but it's bottom up and it's top down.
Yes,
but facts are also on the top, right? It's not that we have facts here and values here.
Well, I think what I'm trying to do.
You can't get to a fact, but through going through a process like this.
I think what I'm trying to do, I think maybe, or it's one way of thinking about it, is that you're positing that we can use rationality as a mechanism for mediating between facts and values. I believe, because otherwise there's no use for rationality. We can just have the facts.
But
so it's a process.
It's even simpler than that. It's just that for me, and I think for everyone, if they will only agree to use language this way, for me, values are simply facts about the experience of conscious creatures. Good and bad experiences give us our values.
Yeah, but they're not simple. That's the problem. And neither are the goods and the bads.
But some are very simple. Having your hand put on a hot stove is incredibly simple. And
not if it'll save your child if you do it.
Well, but again, the unpleasantness of it, right? That's an orthogonal point.
No, it's not. No, it's not. If you look at the way the reward and punishment systems work in the brain, you can easily train an animal using reward to wag its tail if it's being shocked electrically. You can do that, and you can wire it very low to do that.
There's a range of unpleasant experiences we can have where we can construe them as pleasant or necessary, right? And that's a kind of a higher level of, frame around it.
That's the top-down issue. Yeah.
But I'm talking about, the worst possible sensory experience that all of us will agree is unpleasant, right? That doesn't require a story for us to feel aversion to. And there are many things like that in life that are just rudimentary, where it's just we are organized in such a way that if you put us into fire, we don't like it.
So are you claiming then, like, this is another problem? This is where I think that the argument that you make, although accurate in its rudiments, let's say, is insufficiently high resolution, because now it sounds to me like you're including the domain of qualia unquestioningly in the domain of facts. Now you can do that, but we need to know if that's what you're doing. Like, what are these facts you're talking about? Are they mere manifestations of the objective world, or do they shade into the subjective as well?
There are objective facts about subjective experience. So yeah, I can make true or false claims about your subjectivity, and you can make those about your own subjectivity, right? You can be wrong about your own subjectivity. We're not subjectively incorrigible. And I might have said this last time in Vancouver. I mean, the example I often use here is to speculate about what JFK was thinking the moment he got shot, right, is not a completely vacuous exercise. There are literally an infinite number of things we know he wasn't thinking, right? So we can make claims about his conscious mind at that moment in history, which are as scientific, even though the data are unavailable, right? So I mean, many people get confused between having answers in practice and there being answers in principle. I mean, there are many trivial fact-based claims we could make about reality where we can't get the data, but we know the data are there. I mean, so do you have an even or odd number of hairs on your body at this moment? We don't want to think about what it would take to ascertain that fact, right? But there is a fact of the matter, right? And so it is with anything. I mean, so what does a person weigh? many facts are blurry because you're going to weigh him down to the 100th decimal place. No, so it's like at a certain point you're going to be rounding, and someone's weight at that point is changing every microsecond because they're exchanging atoms with the air. So there are facts that can be loosely defined. This is true of our subjective lives too. So if it is a fact about you that when you were praying to Jesus, you felt an upwelling of rapture, right? Subjectively, that can be an absolutely true thing to say about you. We can pair that subjective experience with an understanding of the neurophysiological basis for it. You can think about it in terms of a larger story about your life, but all of this can be translated into a fact-based discussion about what's happening for you. And my only claim is that the value part, and hence the ethics part, relates to the extremes of positive and negative experience that people have in their lives.
First of all, I don't want to dispute the fact that there are stable qualia, pain and pleasure, for example, and also that there are fundamental motivational systems that structure our perception. So as the nervous system increases in complexity, these underlying nervous system subsections that produce these rather stable qualia evolve. Hunger, thirst, defensive aggression, sexuality, all these subsystems that label experience with certain somewhat inviolable labels. I understand that happens. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, I think, to try to increase the breadth of the conversation about how facts get translated into values. Because it seems to me the other thing that your account doesn't take proper, and this is what surprised me so much about your thinking when I first encountered it. See, I think the manner in which facts are translated into values is something that actually evolved, and it evolved over 3.5 billion years, the 3.5 billion years of life, and it built the nervous system from the bottom up, and it built this reducing mechanism that takes the infinite number of facts and translates them into a single value per action, and it does that in layers. And so there is a relationship between the world of facts and the world of values, and there has to be, but it isn't derivable one-to-one in the confines of your single existence through pure rationality. It's way more complicated than that.
Well, yeah, there's more to it than rationality. Yes, I mean, again, it's not rationality that causes you to remove your hand from a hot stove. And it's not rationality that causes you to like the experience of love and bliss and rapture and creativity over or more than pointless misery and despair.
Right. So other things other than rationality are clearly necessary, which is partly my
absolutely.
point.
But
okay.
The question is, do we ever have to be irrational to get the good things in life? And I would argue that the answer to that is clearly no. There's nothing irrational about loving your wife or your best friend or yourself or even a stranger. If what you mean by love there is genuinely wanting happiness for that person, genuinely taking pleasure in their company, genuinely wanting to find a way of being where you're no longer in a zero-sum condition with a stranger or with a partner, but you're collaborating together to have better lives.
Well, it seems to me that you're not...
So rationality moves through that situation continuously, because rationality is the only way that you and I can get our representations of the world to cohere. It's when I say, okay, there's a lion behind that rock, don't go over there. That only makes sense to you if you're playing this rationality game the way I'm playing it. If I mean something else by lion, or I mean something else by don't go over there, you're confused and very likely dead or not.
Well, so
right?
if we're trying to establish the proposition that rationality is the mechanism by which we make our worldviews cohere, I would agree with that in part. We also make them cohere because we're actually biologically structured the same way, and so there's a proclivity for them to cohere to begin with. But we iron out our differences through the exercise. I wouldn't call it rationality. I would call it logos, because I think it's a more it's a broader and
this is where he's smuggling in Jesus. I'm afraid.
I'm not unconscious of that. Let's say.
So if I could, just a point of order here. I'm disconcerted by Douglas's silence.
Yes.
I want to pivot, because I know how good he is when he actually speaks. So I want to pivot to another subject because we can return to this at some point if we need to.
First, before you pivot, say
Yeah, go
something?
for it.
I mean, having said to you what I think your concern is with Jordan, I mean, it strikes me that Jordan's concern, and I share this, just as I share some of your concern that we expressed at the outset. And Jordan's fundamental concern, it seems to me, is one I fundamentally share, which is rationalism isn't enough, and it's. Or let me put it another way.
Okay. But then two of you, can you both show me where it's obviously insufficient? Like
music.
But there's nothing. But again, so to say that there's more to life than being rational, is not to say, and perhaps never to say, you need to run against rationality. You need to be irrational in order to get something good.
Let me express it a different way.
Yeah.
We haven't tried the purely rational approach yet, or we haven't tried it for very long.
Well, many of us have been trying for a couple of centuries at least.
Which is a blip.
Yeah.
I mean, the tiniest dot at the end of human evolution. So I think that a concern which Jordan has, and certainly a concern I have, is if we try this, we can think of all sorts of ways in which it can go wrong. If you take away all that supporting structure, you can think of any number of ways in which it can go wrong. And that I suppose that's at the root of the concern about where you might be taking us. Or to put it another way, if we enter the world that you would suggest, not everyone may necessarily come out as Sam Harris.
Well, give me one way where you think it can go wrong. And again, we can't forget your caveat, which you started with.
What if you're not very smart?
Right. Well,
no,
so
I don't mean.
So then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myths. You know, we smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But
I actually am saying that to some degree. Look. If you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative, because if you can't think well, you're going to think badly, and if you think badly, you're going to fall into trouble. And so it is definitely the case, and this has been what would you call a cliche of political belief for a long time. If you're not very smart, it's better to be conservative, because then you do what everyone else does. And generally speaking, doing what everyone else does is the path of least error moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that rationality is unnecessary.
Nor does it mean that all conservatives are stupid.
It doesn't mean that either. Right, precisely. It doesn't mean
that
either.
Very important caveat.
Yes,
but all conservative structures are not the same either, and that we have many warring and incompatible versions of being conservative.
True. And this is where rationality actually does play its role. Although I don't think it's best conceptualized as rationality precisely, it's definitely the case that to take Douglas's point, that we need to be bound by our traditions, but we need to be judicious in their re-representation and update, and we have to do both.
This is what, in the dialogue on religion, this is what Schopenhauer says. He describes the tragedy of the clergy.
Yeah.
Who he pretty much says, look, if they don't believe it, they recognize it's a very useful metaphor, but they don't need to believe it. They tell it, and he says the tragedy of the clergy is they can never admit that what they're saying is just a metaphor.
Right. So this is before or after he threw his housekeeper down the stairs?
Look, we can all find flaws.
We all have skeletons in our closet. Yeah.
But yes, that there is a way in which religion is what he describes as philosophy for the masses. And that if you recognize that most people are not going to spend their lives studying philosophy, they're not going to be reading about the differences between Leibniz and Kant, that religion has to do. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that particularly, but there's a heck of an argument within there, which a lot of people will be living their lives in.
I don't think it's a good argument if you recall or just imagine what it's like to be a child, especially from the perspective of being a parent. I have two young girls, and they're very smart young girls. They're smart, but one of them's 4.5 years old and knows almost nothing, right? So she knows what I and my wife and our society tell her at some level. At what point is she going to think for herself about these fundamental questions? And I mean, she's currently spending half the day dressed up like Batgirl or Catwoman, right? So if I told her that these superheroes were real, she would believe that for the longest time. And if we lived in a cult that thought they were real, or a whole society that by dint of its geographic or linguistic isolation managed to maintain a conversation about, in this case, Batgirl and Catwoman, that they were real and that it was absolutely important to honor them, and you'd burn in hell if you failed to do this. Well, we would be meeting fully grown adults who believe this sort of thing.
But it seems to me, Sam, that you bring up the superhero thing quite a bit, so I think I'll go after that directly.
Yeah.
So
then I want.
I love superheroes.
Okay, so you make the case in A Moral Landscape that an ideal is real. Because the ideal that you define an ideal is real, and the ideal is whatever maximizes well-being and gets us away from hell. You said not only is that real, you also say that's the fundamental axiom. That's the claim in The Moral Landscape. So you do make a claim that there is a real ideal. And I would say...
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but we are in a circumstance where things can matter, right? Consciousness is the condition in which things can matter, where there can be a range of experiences, some of which are very, very bad. If the word bad means anything, they're bad. And some of which are very, very good, if the word good means anything. And we are navigating in that space. We can't help but navigate or seek to navigate in that space.
Right, absolutely.
And religion is one form of conversation about that navigation problem. And I would argue
let's go back to the ideal.
Often diluted one.
Well, Jordan rolls his sleeves up.
Batgirl.
He means business now.
Batgirl.
But
Batgirl and Catwoman are approximations to a higher ideal. That's what they are.
Well, and to return to this with a biblical idea, I'm fairly sure from personal experience that a lot of parents are perfectly content with bringing their children up vaguely within the story they've inherited. And at some point, the children realize that the fairy doesn't bring them money when their teeth fall out. And at some point, maybe around the same time or a bit later, they discover that Santa Claus doesn't really come down the chimney. And at some point, they realize that actually the whole religious thing is a kind of metaphor, but it's got them through the formative years in some way, often with terrible damage along the way. I concede that. But also with something else. And I'm struck by the number of people, and this is why I share some of what I think is Jordan's concern about the possibility of the world you're envisaging, which is, I can think of a lot of parents now, in my country and other countries as well, who I'm just very struck. They themselves are kind of baby boomer or 60s atheists, humanists, whatever. And I start to notice, for instance, that they're enrolling their children in Christian schools. And I say to them, why are you doing this? And they have fairly coherent arguments along the way, with the lines of the one I've just had. Look, I don't particularly believe this myself, but I think it's a pretty good way to bring up the kids. It's a structure of a kind. And I'm not sure, I can find all sorts of flaws in that. But enough people are doing it that it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I would say yes. It speaks to a real failure of imagination and effort in the secular community to produce truly non-embarrassing alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is across the board. This is not just school. This is how do you conduct a funeral? How do you get married? You know, all of the what rites of passage can you offer a 13-year-old?
What are you doing here? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Just to be the first people in history to have absolutely no explanation for what we're doing at all. Is a big moment.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's the.
That sharpens up my concern perfectly, because to shrink back from that moment and resort to one of the pseudo stories of the past, I consider to be a failure of nerve, both intellectually and morally.
So let's go back to the superhero idea. One of the things you might notice about superheroes is that some of them are actually deities. Right, so in the Marvel pantheon, you have Thor, for example, and so there's a very thin line between the idea of a superhero and the idea of a god, especially if you think about it in a polytheistic manner. So the modern superheroes and the Greek gods, for example, share a tremendous number of features in common. And so here's something to think about. So there's a reason that people admire superheroes, and it's because they act out parts of the hero archetype. That's the technical reason. They're obviously acting something out because that's how you can tell they're superheroes. They share some set of characteristics across the set of superheroes that makes them superheroes. Now the question might be, what is the essential element of being a superhero that makes you a superhero? And the answer, the way that that was solved historically, is that as polytheistic societies developed, and that was usually a consequence of isolated tribes coming into contact with one another, they each had their separate deities. And then over the course of time, those deities warred in actual wars with people, but also conceptually. And out of that polytheistic framework was extracted something that was vaguely monotheistic, as all of those cultures came together to try to determine what their highest ideal should be. So that's the God of gods, that's a way of thinking about it, or the King of kings, that's another way of thinking about it. And that's an implicit ideal.
Well,
and you could make the case that there's nothing more...
Tell that to the Hindus. You tell that to the Hindus. I mean, we've got 1.2 billion people, or maybe it's 1.4 now, who are operating in a religiously saturated system that does not conform to that ideal. There is no one on top of it all.
Well, they're still associated
arguably, there's three on top of it all, but...
Well, there's still an attempt to generate that polytheistic, to integrate that polytheistic reality underneath a single rubric, or you have nothing but continual dissociation of the culture. And I'm not saying this is necessary.
That's a pretty good description of what's going on in India at the moment.
Well, I'm not saying that this is inevitable either. And there is a tension. The problem, this is Nietzsche's observation, and Mircea Eliade as well, the problem with extracting out the highest God from the panoply of gods is the ideal becomes so abstract that it disappears. That's the death of God. And Eliade has tracked that phenomena over multiple cultures. It's not something that's unique to the West. So the danger of that abstraction is that it gets too abstract and disappears and leaves us in the situation that Douglas just pointed out.
Can I throw us back to the key, the key issue of Elton John's glass, which you came up with the other night? Because there's something I wanted to add to that. If perhaps you'd explain why I said Elton John's glass just now.
Well, it came back to this question of what makes something valuable, and I used as an example in Vancouver on one of those nights. If I had a glass here, which I said was actually it was the glass that Elton John used the last time he played in this theater, suddenly it seems to be a more valuable glass. And then Jordan and I argued about just what the status of that value was. I don't know where you want to take this, but yeah.
Well, it's just one thing in particular, which is that the whole issue of what it is you give value to, and let's say that glass was demonstrated for a time to having been drunk from by Elton John at his final concert or his latest farewell tour, whatever.
Yes.
So that's already a glass with some meaning. Let's say that over the years, the whole attribution of that glass becomes debatable. Over a long period of time, a lot of things are going to have happened around it, and to stretch this to breaking point, possibly. Let's say at some point people lose their lives over whether that is Elton John's glass or not. Well, let's say that people start to lose blood.
Let's not just say that. Let's recognize that is the world we're living in with respect to other religions.
So the problem is that we end up, when we're talking about religion, it's the same thing when you're talking about land. You're not just talking about any inherent worth. You're talking also about the worth of things people have given up for this.
Yeah.
And so we end up giving the layers of things. No, it's more than that. We inherit more and more layers of the meaning because other people before us have given that meaning to it. So that by the time you have this object, it's an object of worth, even if it's of no worth in itself at all, but because of the amount of worth that people before you have given to it. And that seems to some extent what we're doing with the religion discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so that's extraordinarily productive, I think. So, see, when you start with the hypothesis of facts, then you kind of have to define what a fact is. And so I think the simplest way of doing that to begin with is that there's a set of objective facts, and that's the facts about objective reality. You can think about that from a scientific perspective. And we're going to agree that exists, although it's very complicated and difficult to understand. That exists as one set of constraints on what we can do and what we can't do. That's the objective world. And then on top of that, and this is where things get very, very complicated, you have this layered system of meaning, which is partly a manifestation of these layers of the nervous system that I described, but also partly a manifestation of those layers of the nervous system operating in social space over vast periods of time. So that would be the sociological agreement. That's all layered on top of the objective world, and it actually constitutes part of the lens through which you view the world, to the degree where you actually see the layering in the thing. So like when you go to a museum and you look at Elvis Presley's guitar, you don't look at the guitar and think that's Elvis Presley's guitar. That's not how your brain works. You actually see Elvis Presley's guitar. It's an act of perception, so it becomes built right into your nervous system. Even though the fact that that is Elvis Presley's guitar, and the reason that that's valuable is because of a sociological agreement about what position Elvis Presley occupied in the dominance hierarchy that we're all part of. And so what you see when you look at an artifact like that is you see a layer of dominance hierarchy overlaid on top of an objective reality. And that's actually your phenomenal reality. Now, the thing that's so interesting is that that layer of perception that's mediating between the facts and you has a structure. And that's the structure that I've been insisting is a narrative. And I think Sam thinks it's a narrative too, because his fundamental ethic is that you should act in a way which means to embody a mode of being, which means to be a personality that moves us from hell to something approximating heaven.
Okay,
but
what
that's not a fact.
Jordan, what I'm struggling to understand, what I don't understand is how any of that is a counterpoint to my concern about religion. So, because I agree with all that. I mean, there are some caveats I would issue. For instance, it's quite possible to walk into a museum, be shown a guitar, not know it's Elvis Presley's guitar, and then be told it's Elvis Presley's guitar, and you can see in real time the change in significance. So that you can see the layers of the perceptual, the meaning accrue. You might actually not even, you might know who Elvis Presley is and not care, right? So there are many different things on the menu here, as opposed to just beholding awestruck Elvis Presley's guitar.
Sam, and
the same is true of the Jesus story or anything else that people, you can find layers of engagement with it that may be more and less useful.
Yes.
My fundamental concern is that the way you are tending to dignify the religious subset of stories as being foundational, necessary, we criticize at our peril, is giving people license to believe things that they clearly shouldn't believe, things that are intrinsically divisive, intrinsically less than optimal as far as organizing an individual human life. We can do better than Christianity on almost every question, with the possible exception of building churches.
Okay, so
right?
the first thing is that I deeply agree with you that mechanism can go wrong. Okay, so you have the objective world, and it's one set of constraints, and then you have this interpretive structure. And I'm not saying that interpretive structure is infallible. It clearly isn't, and neither is the process that gives rise to it. You see this, for example, in conditions like manic depressive disorder with religious delusions or schizophrenia. You see what you see in those situations is a pathologization of that overlay of meaning. That can clearly happen.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now the question is, what do we do about that? How do we keep those perceptual structures, which are somewhat arbitrary, how do we keep them functional? And this is, I think, where your discussion of rationality is so important, particularly when you say rationality is what enables us to establish what we agree on in our shared reality. Okay, so imagine this. So part of the way you orient yourself in the world of facts, objective facts, is through your senses. So you basically have 5 dimensions of triangulation, so to speak, to help you determine what's there in the objective world. And then you have this multi-layer structure that's partly biological and partly cultural that enables you to distill that, but it can go astray, partly because it ages and becomes archaic, and demented for that matter, which is partly your objection to the fundamentalist types. This has been known for a very long time that this sort of thing happens. So what we do, the way we solve that, we have a solution to that. So partly the way we solve that is through articulated discourse. Right? Because you have a way of looking at the world, and I have a way of looking at the world, and we have to occupy the same space. So you're probably wrong about some things, and I'm probably wrong about some things, and hopefully if we talk, we can sort out the differences and make things more stable.
Right.
So,
and I would put rationality right in that place.
right,
That's why rationality is primary.
But the problem, fair enough, but there's a problem with that too. And I think, see, all the times we've talked so far, you've been, I would say, the avatar of a scientific viewpoint, and I've been cast, let's say, as the avatar of a religious viewpoint. But I've actually thought this through scientifically a lot. And I can make a biological argument for all of this, and a developmental argument. So it isn't only rationality that does this. So this is the thing that was so cool about studying, for example, Jean Piaget. Because one of the things Piaget pointed out is that children engage in negotiation. They negotiate their reality just like adults do. But they don't do it only through articulated speech, and neither do adults. What children do is they get together and play. And this is why play is so important for children. That starts to happen when they're about 3 years old, because they can look outside their own idiosyncratic perspective at 3, and they can start to take someone else's viewpoint into consideration, which is what you have to do if you're going to play. And then what children do is they invent little fictional realities. That's what they do when they're pretending. And so they assign each other roles, and they assign a plot and a drama to the pretend play, and then they act it out. And in that action, they bring themselves into harmonious union, right? Which is the act of generating a game that everyone wants to play. And Piaget's observation was, and this is Nietzschean observation as well, that the morality that characterizes society isn't rationality top down, although it's partly that. It's also interactions that are, say, play-based and bottom up. And that's actually how it evolved to begin with, because animals generate societies that are functional, but they don't do it through rationality. They can't, because they don't have rationality. They don't have articulated speech. They have something like an embodied game. Now, what happens, and this is a Nietzschean observation, he's the first person I learned this from, is our morality emerged from the bottom up through thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of shared games, let's say, and the interweaving of those shared games into something approximating a morality that we could all live within peacefully. That happened bottom up. And then what happened was, because we didn't know the mechanism behind that, because it's instantiated in our nervous system invisibly, we watched ourselves act, which is what we do, and then we told stories about that, because that's what we do when we watch ourselves act. And then we encapsulated the morality that evolved in the stories. And that's the religious essence of the story.
I got 10 seconds. So we have to pivot to Douglas for an important question, but I would just say, in response to that, Jordan, I don't disagree with much of consequence in that. My concern, however, is that there's a reason why we differentiate childhood from adulthood, and all of us are stunted to some degree or another in a fairly perverse childhood. And the reason, I mean, what we confront now is a world largely populated by dangerous children, right, who are in their 5th and 6th decade of life.
You mean run by?
Populated and run by, yes, and if anything typifies the childhood of our species, in my view, it is religious orthodoxy. And insofar as we're breaking free of the orthodoxy part and getting something that's more scalable and can survive a more pluralistic and cosmopolitan world, it is because it is being winnowed at every point by rationality. And I think that at some point we could have a fully defensible, rational honoring of many of the things you think are essential, like the power of story, or the power of ritual, or the power of art that is focused on some sacred purpose.